you understand that the church is much more than bricks and mortar. The church is actually a group of people, specifically God's people. And therefore, the leaders of that church need to be top-notch. They need to be a cut above. Because ultimately where the leaders go, then the church will go. And that's why as Christians, we never want to choose a church and follow pastors based off the mechanisms of the world. We don't choose our pastors based on their popularity. It's not on their magnetism or their charisma or how much influence that they have. We don't choose our pastors based off prosperity, how great their business acumen is, or how great they are at fundraising. We certainly don't pick our pastors based on their politics, meaning the right name, and that's how they got into the leadership position that they're in, or even the socio-political views that they have. Although the Bible will inform those, it certainly is not the thing and the reason that we pick a church or follow a man. I'm certain that most of you understand it really is not the outside of the man at all as to why we would follow or support or submit ourselves to a specific church. It's not the outside, it's what? It's the inside. It's really not the tangibles, it's the intangibles. And so this morning, what I want to do is walk you through this beautiful passage in 1 Timothy chapter 3. And if you have your Bibles, take them with me and let's open them up. If you didn't bring a Bible, grab your phone and just type in 1 Timothy 3. You want to add in there New American Standard or NASB, as that's the translation that will be in. And let me give you a checklist for choosing your leaders. And really, this is the third mark of a healthy church. We talked about the gospel. We talked about prayer. Like I said, we skipped over the role of women. You can go back and listen to that. But this would be number 4, technically, that Paul gives to Timothy, the fourth mark of a healthy church. And I want to show you this morning the pastor in his heart, the pastor in his home, the pastor in his church, and the pastor, very briefly, I'll show you, in his city or community. And if you have your Bibles there, let's go ahead and begin reading in 1 Timothy 3, verse 1. Paul says that it is a trustworthy statement. 5 times he uses that. Basically to say, hey, it's all inspired, but out of the inspired material of the canon, these are things that you have to put at the top of the list. And this is one of them. He says it's a trustworthy statement. If any man aspires to the office of overseer, it is a fine work that he desires. And so really that one little verse will give us kind of our primary and summary point for this morning. What is this thing called the pastor or the elder in the church? Now, it's pretty obvious he's talking about an office in the church. There are 2 offices. We'll talk about the second one next week. And he calls this particular office the overseer, literally the watcher or the protector of the church. Notice that it's for men. You want to underline that. If any man aspires, and in the old days we didn't have to even talk about that, but now we do. All right? Pretty clear in the Bible that pastors are going to be, or elders, qualified men, and not women. Again, you can go back and listen to the message on that. And then he says it's really hard work, but it's noble work, and it's expected even that some men will aspire for it. They'll target it. They'll desire it. They'll want it. Now, this little verse really sets the stage for the rest of the chapter, and actually even the next chapter after this. So let's make sure we understand what's going on here. Number 1, is Paul saying that there's 2 different offices in the church. Now, let's go ahead for the sake of vernacular and because of our modern culture, and let's just this morning call it the pastorate and call them pastors. I understand there's also terms like elder, right? Presbyterians have elders. Methodists have bishops. Episcopalians have vicars. If you came from a Catholic church, you have a priest, right? But those are all just synonyms. They're used basically to mean the same thing. For sake of this morning's clarity, let's just roll with pastor. And if you want elder, pastor meaning vocational and paid, elder meaning, unpaid and non-vocational. But let's just, for sake of this morning's clarity, focus on pastor. Number 2 is I want you to notice that he says it's good when men aspire for that. But notice at the end of verse 1, he says, it's good that they aspire for the work. That is huge. If you're a man in here and you've ever thought, hey, I could be a pastor one day, or maybe God would have me be a pastor one day, And then I guarantee you've begun to wrestle with, we all do, the pride and the ego question of like, is this me or is it God? Is it right to feel this or is it wrong to feel this? Well, right there brings a lot of clarity to you if you struggle. Unhealthy ambition is desiring the title. Healthy ambition is desiring the work. See the difference? One is I want to be known as this. The other one is I want to actually give and serve God like this. And that'll help bring clarity to you as you begin to discern that calling, both the internal and the external, upon your life. But notice also that he calls it a work and a noble work. So it's sweaty. It's toilsome. Most people don't believe that, by the way. I know there's like some of you who come in the room, you're like, pastors don't work. No, you guys show up on Sunday for 40 minutes and you talk a little bit. The rest of the week, I think you're taking a nap and watching football. That's what you think, right? But notice right here, he actually calls it work. And we'll talk a little bit more here in a second as to why that is. Now, hopefully you understand why it's a noble work, right? Because the church doesn't belong to people. The church belongs to who? To Christ. Christ died for this thing. Christ purchased this thing. And literally by his blood, we are brought together, and then Christ is the one who started it, and he appointed these apostles at the very beginning who were going to be the foundation, Ephesians 2, for it. And then they're the ones who went out and appointed the elders, the pastors, the overseers, who would then equip the saints for the work of service. And here we are now, 2,000 years later, on the other side of that, and we're sitting in a room because we're a part of this massive organism, this living family that generation after generation keeps going. And that's why the picture here, friends, is not of some CEO who entrepreneurial started something and said, now everybody just needs to do what I say. The picture here is always in the New Testament of a group of men who are qualified for this office, and they work together to walk in harmony, to pray and ask the will of Christ, and to step unanimously forward into whatever direction the Lord would lead them. That's the picture we have here of this beautiful, exciting, growing, millennia-old organism called the church. And by the way, you're all a part of that because the ultimate goal of the pastors is to raise and release more men and women in their areas of gifting so they can step forward and do the work of ministry and impact the world for the glory of Christ. And that's the reason why Paul puts such a strong checklist in front of the church. And he says, here is the model Christian. Here are the type of men you want in roles of authority and leadership in that church. And it's a daunting list. It's a high bar because it's a beautiful bride. And so this morning, I want to take you through it real briefly in those 4 points. And so number one, here we go. Let's talk about the pastor and his heart. Let's talk about the inside real quick, okay? The pastor in his heart. And you can see it there in verse 2. He says, an overseer then, the protector or the watcher, you call it synonyms, the shepherd. The overseer then must be, now very important to look at the must be, you might want to even underline that, must be a present participle of necessity, meaning everything we're about to read, this has to be this way, it's got to be this way. There's no ands, ifs, or buts about it. An overseer then must be, and the first qualification is above reproach. He's got to be unblameable. Meaning there's no handle to pull, meaning that if he were charged with a crime, for example, he would get to the courthouse and they would drop all the charges. He just couldn't be arrested, he couldn't be held. That's the idea. Now, real important right here that we stop and we clarify something. This is super helpful and encouraging for many of you, okay? He's not talking right here about the man's BC days, before Christ's days. He's not talking about the individual's pre-conversion days. Very important to understand that, right? That's why it's in the present tense. This is a current state. Also, if he were talking about that, then Paul himself would not have qualified to be in ministry, and by the way, nor would anybody. So understand that. What he is talking about, equally important, is a man's current Christian testimony. Basically, that there is a track record as you and I look back over his tenure, 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years, whatever it was, since he was saved, that you can look back and you can say, okay, the practical graces of God are obviously at work in that man's life. And you understand why that's so important, because if a pastor sins, what happens? It confuses everybody. It feels more hypocritical than any other sin. His influence can cause confusion in the church if he's not a man of purity and walking blamelessly, so you can understand why that's so important. Now, hopefully you all understand. I know everyone in this church knows you do have a perfect pastor, right? Everyone, Dean, Pastor Desmond, right? You know that. You know, it's interesting, Providence, right? I think it's fascinating how God works. It's like literally just this week, I got a phone call. And the guy said, hey, I know what you did. I said, well, you do? I do too, and tell me. And he said, I know about you. And I know that you were a rebellious teenager. And I know that you were at 19 married, and you were divorced, and you were unfaithful to your wife. And I said, yeah, and worse. And he said, what do you have to say for yourself? And I said, well, I was saved by Christ. And I had to go back and I had to reconcile and repent to my ex-wife and to her new husband and to her parents, even begging their forgiveness. He said, no, you don't understand. I know about you. He said, I know also that you walked away from the church and that you were prodigal and you actually said some really mean things to your family and you took off. I said, I know, and then I got saved by Christ. And I went back and had to reconcile and had to meet with the elders and had to talk with them, and the Lord mercied me. And he let me sweep floors and let me be discipled and put me on the mission field and let me be a part of a college ministry and go off to Bible college and seminary. And then he gave me a beautiful wife and 3 kids who I believe to this point are walking with the Lord for 25 years now. I said, literally, that phone call happened this week. Friends, let me just be as super clear as I possibly can here. You do not have perfect men as pastors. We are not perfect men. We are purchased men. We are redeemed men. We were bought with a price. We are slaves to righteousness. We are forgiven men, but we were not perfect men. And some of you here in the room, just this morning, if you don't hear anything else I say, you need to hear everything else I say. But if you don't hear anything else, some of you just need that. Because in our evangelical conservative circles and reformed world, there's almost a stigma now where if you've got certain kinds of sins, you're out. And you need to hear today, listen closely, that if you say, I've got significant sin, so does everybody else in the room. And you say, my sin just looms so large over my life. Listen, no sin looms larger than the cross of Christ. And all of us are found equal at the cross of Christ. All of us are on our knees at the cross of Christ. And the one thing you want to do is you want to join Paul wherever you are and whatever you've been through when he said, one thing I do every morning is I forget what lies behind and I reach for what lies ahead. And if you blew the first quarter, you can trust that God will help you in the second, third, and fourth to go on and finish the race and win the game. If you blew the first half of your game, you can still come back in the third and fourth and God can give you an opportunity to finish well. He is not done with you. That's why he then goes on and he says, listen, when you look at a man and you look at his testimony and his track record since conversion, these are the things you got to see if you want him to be in the ministry. And he's super clear on the present tense of these. Look at him. Just go through them one at a time. He says he needs to be above reproach. You ready? The husband of one wife. Literally a one-woman man. That's what it means. Mia skenaikis andros. And there's no definite article on the wife. This is not marital status. This is moral behavior. He's got to be devoted to one woman. Not polygamous, not a flirt, not a philanderer, one woman in his eyes, one woman in his heart, and one woman in his bed. He literally is devoted only to her. And then he goes on in verse 2 and he says he's got to be temperate. Meaning he's clear-headed and he's consistent and he's steady and he's not flighty. He's not jumping around all the time from thing to thing and idea to idea. Yeah, that's one of the curses of being in our 20s, right? I'm going to start this business and change the world. Now I'm going to work for Chick-fil-A. Now I'm going to go off and I'm going to start and invent this product. It's just literally, you can't do that. It's not an existential crisis. The man of God needs to be consistent and steady. He goes on and says prudent. You see that word, prudent, sophroneo or sophron? He says you have a self-controlled mind. He's not scatterbrained. He plans well. He stewards his time. He charts his goals. He manages his finances. He structures his meetings. And if you're in the room and you're going, man, I wonder if I'm called to be a pastor, you need to be asking yourself right now. Now, here's the funny thing. Everyone who doesn't want to be a pastor goes, well, guess I'm done. But I got a question for you. You ready? Where can a church pull its pastors from if all the men aren't targeting this particular level of righteousness? The implicit statement by Paul here, gentlemen, is that all of us are striving to be this. If you walked into the room, you go, what's a biblical man? This is a biblical man. What's God's man supposed to look like? This is what he's supposed to look like. So keep going. He's prudent. He's also respectable. You see that? He moves from the inside now to the outside. Cosmios, you can hear cosmetology in there. That's the ordered life on the outside. He's well-mannered, he's well-groomed, he's healthy, he's not overweight, he's not sloppy, he's not disheveled, right? I actually love the old Reformed preacher Albert Martin. If you ever listen to him, he's great. He said, gentlemen, do not walk up into your pulpit with your paunch hanging over your belt and your jiggling jowl jaggling. He says, your people will know right away that you're talking to them about discipline, but you have none yourself. Now, is that not true? No one says it. But when you got a hefty guy up here and he's grabbing the pulpit and he's talking to you about discipline, you're in the back of your mind going, man, you could use some jazzercise. little CrossFit. He's hospitable. See it in verse 2? Loving of strangers, and referring to the outsider or the foreigner here, he says he doesn't allow the social distinctions to cloud his judgment. He opens up his home and he relates and he cares for all. He's able to teach, and by the way, you could underline that. That's not gifting there. It's in a list of qualifications of character, meaning he just has the ability to communicate basic doctrine. He knows doctrine, he lives doctrine, he can help others understand doctrine. And how about verse 3? He's not addicted to wine or pugnacious, meaning he's not a bar hopper. He's not frequenting alcohol. You don't, when you think of him, go, oh, he's a guy who's always going to have alcohol in the fridge. That's just not him. And then he adds in that word pugnacious, which, have you ever seen a pug dog? You know those little guys, and they're small, but they're mighty, and they go, look like they're going to try to eat your face off, right? That's the picture here. That's the picture. He's not going to be a guy who's a striker. He doesn't have a short fuse. He's not bowing up all the time. He's not always ready to rumble because, verse 3, instead he is gentle and what? Uncontentious. Opposite of that little fighting bulldog, he's a stallion that's reined in. His strength is under control. It's moderated, right? You picture John Wayne in the old movies, right? You got the Indians coming and the bullets are flying and all the settlers are running, freaking out under wagons. And what does John Wayne do? He walks out. He says something like, well, it looks like somebody's got a hitch in their giddy up, or something like that. The point is he's not freaking out. He's under control. So you can revile the man, you can bow up on the man, and he's always under control. He's got internal sobriety. I had a buddy once, a friend who was a pastor, and he was in a meeting with a deacon who was very upset with him. And this deacon actually, got up and he started going after my friend. My friend's wife was in the room. So he's sitting there and he's taking it, and then all of a sudden the deacon turns and he starts going after his wife. Now, my friend was a football player. He was fiery. So he started to stand up. His face went all red. His fist clenched. And all of a sudden, his wife grabbed his shirt and pulled him over, and she whispered in his ear, and she said, don't let me be your weakness today. See, that's the picture here. Even if you go after his wife, he's still God's man. And then he finishes with the free from the love of money. We all read 2 Peter this week in our Bible reading, right? He's not a guy who's getting the big cars and trying to get the big houses. And by the way, if you ever just wanted to know if a man's a false teacher, that's really your best way to know. Is just simply look at how he deals with money. Is his impetus money, his driver money? Does he always love money? Is he focused on money, always talking about money? Does he dress like he just appreciates money? That's really an indicator that a man is not in it for the right reasons. I had a friend tell me one time, he said, you make sure no matter how much money the Lord blesses you with, you give it away. You don't drive it, you don't buy it, and you don't wear it. It's a pretty good reminder for a pastor. So if you're in the room today and you're going, I think maybe I could be a pastor, just memorize this and ask yourself the honest question. Are you above reproach? Are you the husband of one wife? Are you temperate, prudent, hospitable, respectable, and able to teach? Are you not addicted to much wine or pugnacious, but gentle and contentious and free from the love of money? And if you go, I think that actually I am, you may be qualified to step forward into ministry. But every single brother in the room should be asking those questions, saying, how do I match up when I look at the noble character, the qualities of a man of God? But what's fascinating about this little text is he doesn't end with the characteristics and go, hey, brother, go ahead and figure it out. He actually adds on an interview tool, an assessment tool for the church. So number 2, move from the man's heart. Now move to the pastor, ready? In his home. In his home. Look at this in verse 4 and 5. He must be one who manages his own household very well, keeping his children under control with all dignity. Let's just stop there. So where do you guys work? Some of you guys work for Chick-fil-A, wonderful company. If you work for Chick-fil-A, let me know. I'll come to your Chick-fil-A, and I think you can help me give me a discount. Let's do that. Let's work that out, right? But some of you work in high rises. Some of you work as doctors. Some of you guys, law firms. Some of you are mechanics, right? Just imagine if you were going in for an interview process, picture your work, and you met the first 2 interviews, went through them with flying colors. And then the HR director said, hey, mister, I'll go with Nate. Nate, you're the man. So Nathan Taylor, we like you here, and we want you here. You answered your questions. It's obviously clear you know your job. And so Nate's sitting there. He's like, wow, I got this thing sealed. I'm ready to talk money now. And then all of a sudden at the end, they go, but we have one more thing that we do here. It's called a third interview, where Bob over there, you look over at Bob, he's sitting in the corner, and he's like, yeah, that's my job. Bob's going to actually be coming over to your house, Nate. He's going to have a suitcase, and he's going to be sitting with you and your wife, and you guys are up to 49 kids now, and he's going to be there for a week. He's going to watch how your home runs, and based on how your home runs, then we're going to hire you. All right, guys, let's just talk. I want you to just get real straight right now, okay? Think about it. Right now, Bob is at your house, watches your wife, your kids for a week. Is he coming back and making the recommendation or not on your hire? Now, real quick, let's go ahead. If you have a pen, just do a little bit of work with me here. Write down a few notes in the margin, okay? This is important. I think it's very wise, number 1, on this verse, to make sure that we give some leeway here. Let me give you the reason. You could leeway is kind of an old word. Give some margin. Might be a better way to say. Give some margin here on men, because here's why. Okay, the terminology he uses is really referring to kids 12 and under. That's the Greek word, because back then, by the time a child was 13, 14, you were off into your trade. They didn't have this crazy thing we have nowadays called teenagers who live at home. So we got to be somewhat thoughtful with the enculturation aspect of what's going on here. You remember Martin Luther, his famous quote? Have I told you that? He was getting really famous in the 1520s, and they said, how do you stay so humble? He said, I've got teenagers. Right? So we need to be thoughtful here about basically, what he's saying and what he isn't saying. Also, another reason to be very thoughtful, ready, number 2, is be wise to not call this salvation. Salvation is of the Lord. Now, immediately some people in the room will go, well, but Titus 1:6, the parallel says children who believe. But you'll notice that even in the more modern translations like the LSB, that has been shifted out of believe to faithful, because that word can go either way. And that's a better rendering that fits better with this particular analogy or allegorical or parallel text. And so you want to be really careful there to say, okay, salvation's of the Lord, and yet I need to make sure that we have a home where my child, lock, stock, and barrel, believes in the faith. Now, we don't even really know that our child is going to believe until they're independent and free from the home. We don't find out till they're well into their 20s whether they're truly walking with the Lord or not. So we got to be super, super, super gentle there with the idea of belief. In fact, the term that he uses here, under control, hupotage is the Greek word, is a military term. And so probably the best rendering is, what he's saying is, when you look at a young child under 12, and you're looking at the man's home, generally speaking, is there order? Are all the children, from 14 down, are they abiding by general requirements? Do they, generally speaking, esteem mother and father? And here's a key. Are they on a trajectory to become upstanding citizens? And that seems to be the heart, both in Titus and here in 1 Timothy, as to what Paul is saying. So we want to have some leeway there, some patience. But we cannot get around the fact that a man's children and home is, in fact, a barometer for whether he should be leading the church or not. That's why you have that sobering parentheses in verse 5. Look at it, it's right there. But if a man doesn't know how to manage his own household, if things aren't in order and they're not running efficiently and the children aren't upstanding and they're not showing esteem, rhetorical question, how will he take care of the church? So you can understand there's one major thing Paul's saying, which is if he can't run the mini church and the children aren't respectful, then why would we assume that he could manage the larger church where adults would become respectful? But right there, listen closely, friends, is where I want to add in, just like I did before, a layer of hope. If you're in the room and you're a brother and you've had some tough years and the home has fallen apart and your children have not done everything that you thought that they would, listen to me, please. One way to read this could be that Paul is simply saying, right now is not the time for church leadership. Paul very well could be saying, hey, listen, make your home the priority for this season. Go back and get little Johnny Jr. and beautiful Sally Mae, get them going, and then in a few years, let's talk about whether you'll then have time to prioritize the church of Christ. So listen, brothers, if you're in the room and you're in a tough season, just like I said before, it does not mean that God is done with you. It may mean it's not for you, but it doesn't have to mean that. So keep praying, keep working, keep fighting, keep leading, and trust the Lord. Now notice what he says here in verse 6, because he moves from the heart, the inside of the man, to his home, to verse 6. Let's just talk about real quickly the pastor in his role. Just one big statement about what he cannot be when he steps into the ministry in the church. Verse 6, not a new what? Did I lose you already? I lost you. Come on, second service. I need you today. Come on. Not a new convert. Lest what happened? He become conceited and fall into the condemnation incurred by the devil. Now, we all love new believers. You guys remember what it was like to be a new believer? It's exciting, and there's a wonder of grace and a devotion to worship, and you're passionate to evangelize. But let's all be clear, all the authenticity and all the passion of a new believer, for all of the enthusiasm of a new believer, we would not want them to be leading our church. Does anybody disagree with that statement? Of course not. Okay, you're going to have a major surgery. That's not a prophecy. I'm not a prophet. I'm just saying, you're about to go into one, right? And it's not exciting, some really bad thing, your kidney or something like that. Okay, raise your hand if you want the doctor operating on you to be the dude who just finished med school. All right, let's take it. You want to go let's go to hyperbole here. You get to go to the moon on the next space shuttle. How cool would that be? So you're strapping in. You just can't wait to go to the moon with the dude who has no flight hours. Now, I'm going to be asking that guy, how many times have you been to the moon and back before I'm strapping in there and putting all that fuel behind me? I'm going to be holding on going, I trust that this guy has what? Been there and come what? He's come back. How much more so our soul care? We're talking eternity. We're talking heaven and hell. Someone that's going to walk us on the road to righteousness and sanctification from one degree of glory to the next. How much more so? And our wife and our children. How much more so would we want to put our lives and souls in the hands of someone who says, I've been there and I've come back. Now, here's what's so interesting. He actually uses a word here, new convert, for a new sprig, a little sapling, a new little upshoot, a new little plant. Just like when you go out to the woods and you see one of those little tiny pine trees, and you're looking at it going, man, if there is a hot summer, if there's a little bit of wind, that thing ain't going to make it. But then you look up at one of the sequoias, and you go, but that one, I think will survive. That's the imagery here. Now, here's his point. He says, you don't want the little sapling to be your leader in church, and here's the reason why. Look at it there. What happens? Lest he become conceited. It's going to be really easy for him to get puffed up and idealistic and headstrong and rash and opinionated. Seeing ministry as a sprint and not a marathon. It's easy for him to lose his joy and his confidence and to begin depending on his personality and his charisma and his magnetism and his education. And often I've seen this one too, sheer willpower. And here's what will happen. He'll go from these big highs to these big lows, these big highs and these big lows, and he'll start to depend on his own strength. And then all of a sudden, what happens? Do you see it there at the end? He'll fall into the condemnation incurred by who? And you know that's an objective genitive, meaning he's going to experience the same outcome that the devil experienced, which was what? Boom! A thundering crash. Pride goes before the fall, he says. I was actually talking with the interns a couple of weeks ago, great group of men this semester, and I was intrigued because something hit me that I hadn't really thought about before. We were talking about timelines in ministry and kind of the life sketch, providentially, how the Lord tends to work in the lives of men that he calls to ministry. And something hit me, and it really struck me. Isn't it interesting in the Bible? Have you ever realized when you're reading how long God always makes everybody wait? By the way, who's in a waiting season right now where you're praying for something that you really believe is God's will, and you're just like kind of on pause? You're like, Lord, all right, so nobody. That's what I thought. Yeah, I thought so, right? Have you ever just realized how in the Bible everybody has to wait? Noah, how long did he have to wait? Long time. 100 years, 120 years? What about Abraham? 20, 25? What about Joseph? 10? Possibly 20? What about David? Hills of En-Gedi. Even the New Testament, the apostles are waiting in the upper room. Peter's being told to wait at the seashore. Paul's being told to go wait in Arabia. Even the ladies, Ruth and Esther and Naomi and Elizabeth, Elisheba and Anna, and you go on and on. Everybody, then you get to Hebrews 11, and a lot of them were waiting for things that what? They never even got. Now ask yourself the really obvious question. Why, in all of human history, does God always make his people wait? Right there, you just got your answer. Because he loves them. And he knows that if he gives them too much too soon, they will what? They will implode like a hot air balloon that is cut with a knife, like the Hindenburg coming down in flames. Boom! And then what happens to the family, what happens to the ministry, what happens to the church, what happens to the community is it's left in shambles. So he makes us wait so that we're equipped. Now, did you catch right there? Look down at verse 7, that he finishes with the city. He moves from the inside, the heart, to the home, to the role, and then he comes all the way out to even the city. Did you see that in verse 7? And he must have a good reputation with those outside the church so that he may not fall into reproach in the snare of the devil. All that is, I'll just make it real short, it's just a certifying testimony. What he's saying is that when people talk about the pastors around the city, you go to Sprouts and you go to the Sprouts by, Brian Lamb's store or house, and you ask the attendant, the clerk at Sprouts, you say, hey, what do you think about that guy with the big beard over there? The Sprout clerk should say something like, well, I don't believe with everything that he says, but he's obviously a good man. He's obviously someone who believes what he believes. The idea is the community looks at the men and they go, wow, actually, I think they actually really do live out what they say. But notice that he mentions the devil again. Did you catch it? There's the devil again, 2 times in 7 verses. Because the devil's a warlord and he sends snipers out to take out pastors, because if he can take out the pastors, then it'll send the church into confusion and it'll slow their impact on a community. Show of hands, who's ever been a part of a church where the pastor had some kind of moral failure? Okay, now, everyone who just raised your hands, you don't have to raise your hands again on this, but just nod your head with me. Did that not send you, your family, and the larger community into a ton of internal turmoil and confusion? The devil knows that. Which is why, if you go, well, what can we do with a sermon that's literally from pastors to pastors, one of the big things that you please can do is you can pray for your pastors. Let me give you a little insight to what happens when pastors go to their conferences. They talk about you. You say, that's gossip. No, not by name. Generally. Let me give you a little insight here real quick. This will be helpful for you. There's 4 types of sheep in every church around the whole world. Did you know that? Only 4. So think about it. Which one are you? You ready? We sometimes people will call them different names. You can call them, kind of a VDS. You could call them a VNS. You could call them a VKS or a VIS. All right? So maybe in your Bible you could just noodle these here in the corner and you could ask yourself, which one am I? Every church in the world, one of these 4. Ready? Here they are. So the VDS, you're going to love this one, is called the very difficult sheep. Now, we don't got too many of these at Mission Bible, but they're always around, right? This is the sheep who, is inside the pasture and doesn't really like to be inside the pasture and the pen, yet stays inside the pen and then bites the hand of everyone who feeds him. Just picture him in the corner. He's the little grizzled one back there. And all the other sheep are a little bit nervous, and the pastors are like, well, I got to take care of Bob over there. And he kind of walks over, and then boom, he bites his hand every time. Those exist. Not too often, but there's a few. No, next one, here we go. So VDS, and here's also, next one, VNS. A very, you ready, needy sheep. And bless their heart, they got needs. And by the way, where else would you go? That's what the church is. It's a hospital to bandage you up. So good, stay. But emotionally and mentally and spiritually and often even physically, man, year after year, those sheep need a lot of care. And like I said, good. That's what you're here for. But then you get to the next category and things get exciting. We call them the VKSs, the very kind sheep. And these are just the sheep that it doesn't matter what's going on. They're dancing around, they're jumping, they're bubbling, they're bringing joy. By the way, thank you guys so much for this last month. We have received hundreds and hundreds of cards from you. And so many meals that we all have gained. I'm going to have that big paunch and jiggle and jowl very soon because of you. Thank you. And you come by with your smiles and you fire off your emails, and it is such a blessing to be around people who just live out the kindness and the warmth of Christ. How beautiful it is. But that leads us to the last one, and this is the one that every congregant always wants to be striving for. We call them the very impactful sheep, the ones who literally are driving like in high-octane fuel the ministry. They're the ones that aren't asking for anything. They're giving everything. They're contributing. They're serving, they're giving, they're loving, and here's the key today, they're praying for their pastors. And I just want to tell you as flat out as I possibly can, those 20% right there are the ones that make 80% of the ministry happen at a church, and you guys are the ones that make this such a joy to be a part of Mission Bible. Because you do the work of service. So thank you. Thank you. You can pray. But what's so interesting about this text right here, friends, is that this really is not a text where I'm to preach conviction at you. This text was given by Paul for the preacher to tell the people how to then analyze him. So you need to look at me, you need to look at each of the pastors and elders, and you need to ask these questions, and you need to decide if this is a healthy church or not. So just do it right now. We're looking at each other in the eyeballs. So this is actually a sermon to you to be analyzing me, and so I'm going to ask you now to analyze me and the rest of the pastors and elders on these three things. You ready? Number one, Paul was really clear. Does our inner life match our public image? No, you don't say it out loud. This is inside. That was a very kind sheep, right? It's like, we love you. It just ask the question. Does what you see on the outside match the inside? I was trying to think if there was anything left in my life where you could roll up to my house at any time and you'd go, oh, didn't see that one coming. I think I got one. I actually bought one of those $200 red infrared UV lights that they say make your face get less wrinkled and makes you get younger. My wife and I were talking about it. We're like, if we're decaying anyway, let's try to decay gracefully. And so I literally went and bought one for $200, you know. And so if sometimes you were to come to my house, I wake up in the morning, and right before I got to get my Bible and do my workout, I sit there and I hold a red light over my face. That was all I had. I was like, but seriously, think about it. Think about all the men. And then number two, think about their families, their wives, and their kids. Picture them in your mind right now, their family. Do their wife and kids verify their calling? My wife and children were in first service. They'll be in next service. They're not in this one because she's over doing discipleship. But when you look at Bree, and when you look at Ethan, and when you look at Peyton, and when you look at Ezekiel, I'm still working on him, but when you look at him, and now take all the other pastors and elders, when you look at their family, does it testify to the fact that there is a practical outworking of God's grace in their life? And then number three, just think about the community. Does the community at large affirm the fact that they are who they say that they are? Now, here's the key. If you came in right now and you're listening to this and you're looking at my life and their life and you go, I don't think so, man, then this is not a healthy church. And you got to find a better one. But if you say, yeah, I actually believe that is the pastors and elders of this church, then that's mark number 4. And you're in a healthy church. Now, I can't speak for myself, but let me speak for these brothers that I get to work with every day and I love. These are good men. These are good men. And, you know, honestly, if I lived in Southern California and I had to put my family under the authority of some men, those are the guys that I would choose. Now, I'm biased, and Dean is perfect, and Desmond's perfect. But in all seriousness, it's a good man.